Another random Middle Eastern passenger to deal with. Agent Martinez sighed, not knowing she was about to humiliate a legendary Special Forces commander. The bustling John F. Kennedy International Airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of international travel. But Terminal 4's security checkpoint was about to become the scene of one of the most shocking displays of prejudice in TSA history. Colonel Khalil Al-Mansouri, 68 years old and traveling alone on a simple domestic flight to Dallas, approached the security checkpoint with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated far more dangerous situations than an American airport. His weathered face, marked by decades of service in the world's most hostile environments, showed no sign of the extraordinary military career that had made him a legend among Special Forces communities worldwide. Dressed in civilian clothes, a simple navy blue polo shirt, khaki pants, and comfortable walking shoes, Khalil looked like any other elderly traveler making his way through the security process. His carry-on bag contained only the essentials: reading materials, prescription medications, and a small leather portfolio that held documents he hoped he would never need to reveal in a civilian setting. TSA agent Maria Martinez, 34 years old and employed at JFK for 7 years, had processed thousands of passengers during her career. Her training had emphasized the importance of remaining vigilant for potential security threats, but over the years, her vigilance had gradually transformed into something more troubling: a pattern of enhanced scrutiny that seemed to target passengers of Middle Eastern appearance with disproportionate frequency. The security checkpoint itself was a marvel of modern technology and bureaucratic efficiency, with multiple lanes of X-ray machines, metal detectors, and full-body scanners processing hundreds of passengers every hour. The constant stream of travelers created a rhythm that TSA agents knew by heart. Shoes off, laptops out, liquids in clear bags, arms raised for the scanner. But for passengers who fit certain profiles, this routine process could become something much more invasive and humiliating. "Sir, step out of line for additional screening," Martinez commanded as Khalil approached the metal detector, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. She had made this decision within seconds of seeing him, based entirely on his appearance and her own unconscious biases about who posed a potential threat to aviation security. Khalil complied without protest, stepping aside to a designated area where passengers selected for enhanced screening were processed separately from the regular flow of travelers. He had experienced this type of treatment countless times over the years, understanding that his appearance often triggered additional scrutiny despite his exemplary record of service to the United States. TSA Supervisor David Johnson, a 15-year veteran of airport security who had worked his way up from entry-level screener to management, noticed the interaction from his position overseeing the checkpoint. At 45 years old, Johnson prided himself on running an efficient operation that balanced security concerns with passenger convenience. But his own biases often influenced how that balance was applied to different travelers. "Martinez, make sure you check everything twice with this one," Johnson said quietly as he approached the screening area, his words carrying the implication that the elderly Palestinian passenger deserved more suspicion than the average traveler. "We can't be too careful with passengers who fit certain profiles." The comment was overheard by several other passengers waiting in nearby lines, including Dr. Sarah Chun, a civil rights attorney traveling to Dallas for a conference on discrimination in federal agencies. Chun had spent her career documenting exactly this type of profiling, and she immediately recognized the discriminatory nature of what was unfolding before her eyes. Agent Marcus Thompson, working the X-ray machine that would screen Khalil's carry-on bag, had been with TSA for only 2 years, but had already absorbed the institutional culture that viewed certain passengers as inherently more suspicious than others. At 28 years old, Thompson was eager to prove himself to his supervisors and often erred on the side of excessive caution when dealing with passengers who matched what he had been trained to consider high-risk profiles. "Sir, I need you to remove your shoes, belt, and any metal objects," Martinez instructed Khalil, her tone suggesting that he was already under suspicion before the screening process had even begun. "Place all items in the bins and step through the metal detector slowly." Khalil complied with each instruction methodically, his movements precise and economical in the way of someone accustomed to following security protocols in far more dangerous environments. As he removed his shoes, several passengers in nearby lines began to notice the extra attention he was receiving, some watching with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable recognition that they were witnessing discrimination in action. The metal detector remained silent as Khalil passed through, indicating no metallic objects that could pose a security threat. However, Martinez was far from finished with her screening process, having already decided that this passenger required the most thorough examination possible. "Sir, I'm going to need to conduct a manual pat-down," Martinez announced, her voice loud enough to draw attention from other passengers and TSA agents in the area. "Please stand with your feet apart and arms extended." The request for a pat-down immediately elevated the situation from routine screening to public humiliation. Other passengers began to stare, some pulling out phones to record what appeared to be an example of airport profiling. The attention created exactly the kind of spectacle that made the screening process feel less like security and more like punishment for having the wrong appearance. Agent Rodriguez, who had been processing Khalil's carry-on bag through the X-ray machine, called out to his colleagues. "I'm seeing some unusual items in this bag that need hand inspection," he announced, though the items in question were simply the reading materials and personal documents that any traveler might carry. Dr. Sarah Chun, who had been observing the interaction with growing concern, began to document what she was witnessing. As a civil rights attorney specializing in discrimination cases, she recognized all the signs of profiling: the immediate selection for additional screening, the unnecessarily thorough search process, and the public nature of the humiliation being inflicted on the elderly passenger. "This is completely inappropriate," Chin said to the passenger standing next to her in line, her voice carrying far enough for TSA agents to hear. "They're clearly targeting this man based on his ethnicity, not any legitimate security concern." Supervisor Johnson overheard the comment and approached Chun with the defensive attitude of someone who knew his actions were being scrutinized. "Ma'am, we follow strict security protocols that apply equally to all passengers," he said, though his own instructions to Martinez had clearly contradicted that claim. Meanwhile, Khalil endured the pat-down process with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout his military career. The TSA agent's hands moved across his body with unnecessary thoroughness, checking areas that clearly posed no security risk, while other passengers watched the degrading spectacle unfold. "Sir, I'm going to need you to explain the purpose of your travel and the contents of your bag," Martinez said as the hand inspection revealed Khalil's reading materials and personal documents. "These items seem unusual for a typical domestic traveler." The documents that had caught Martinez's attention were actually Khalil's personal copies of military strategy papers and historical analyses that he reviewed regularly as part of his ongoing work as a military consultant. However, to someone unfamiliar with military documentation, they appeared suspicious simply because they dealt with topics related to international conflict and security operations. Agent Thompson joined the inspection, holding up one of Khalil's documents for closer examination. "This looks like some kind of military or intelligence material," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We might need to call in additional security for this." The suggestion that federal security needed to be called drew even more attention to the screening area, creating a crowd of onlookers who were now watching an elderly man being treated as a potential security threat. Several passengers began recording the incident on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become a significant news story. Dr. Chin approached the screening area directly, her legal training telling her that the situation had crossed the line from routine security into discriminatory harassment. "Excuse me, but I'm an attorney, and what I'm witnessing here appears to be clear profiling based on this passenger's ethnicity," she said to Supervisor Johnson. Johnson's response was defensive and dismissive. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your place in line and allow us to do our job. We're following established security protocols." But Chun was not easily deterred. "Sir, I specialize in discrimination cases involving federal agencies, and I can tell you that what you're doing here violates this passenger's civil rights and TSA's own anti-discrimination policies." The legal challenge from a qualified attorney immediately changed the dynamic of the situation. Johnson realized that his actions were being observed and documented by someone with the expertise to hold him accountable, but he was too invested in the screening process to back down without losing face in front of his subordinates in the watching crowd. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me to a private screening room for additional questioning," Johnson announced to Khalil, escalating the situation to its most serious level. The request for private questioning was typically reserved for passengers who posed genuine security concerns, not elderly travelers whose only crime was their ethnic appearance. It was at this moment that Khalil finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command situations. "Before you make that decision, I suggest you verify my identity through the appropriate military channels." The suggestion that military verification might be necessary sent a ripple of confusion through the TSA team. They were accustomed to dealing with civilian passengers, and the mention of military credentials introduced a complication they hadn't anticipated. "Sir, unless you can provide proper military identification, you'll need to comply with our standard security procedures," Johnson replied, though his confidence was beginning to waver as he realized the situation might be more complex than he had assumed. Khalil reached slowly into his wallet, his movements deliberate and visible to avoid any misinterpretation by the TSA agents who were now treating him as a potential threat. He withdrew a military identification card that immediately changed the atmosphere of the entire interaction. The ID identified him as Colonel Khalil Al-Mansouri, United States Army Special Forces, retired, with security clearances at levels that most TSA agents had never encountered. The document also indicated his status as a military consultant with ongoing responsibilities that required him to travel frequently for national security purposes. Agent Martinez stared at the ID with growing comprehension and horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The elderly Palestinian man she had been treating as a security threat was actually a decorated American military officer whose service record was likely more distinguished than anyone in the airport. This can't be right," Thompson stammered as he examined the military credentials. "Special Forces colonels don't just walk through regular security checkpoints." But Khalil's documentation was entirely legitimate and easily verifiable through military databases that TSA had access to for exactly these types of situations. A quick check would reveal a service record that included deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 4 decades, decorations for valor under fire, and expertise in counterterrorism operations that had literally saved American lives. Supervisor Johnson realized that his decision to escalate the screening had potentially created a major incident involving a high-ranking military officer. The implications for his career, the TSA's reputation, and the airport's relationship with military personnel were all suddenly at stake. "Colonel Al-Mansouri, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience," Johnson said. His tone completely changed as he recognized the authority represented by Khalil's credentials. "If we had known about your military status, this screening would have proceeded very differently." But Khalil was not interested in quick apologies that failed to address the underlying problem. "Supervisor Johnson, the issue isn't that you didn't know my military rank. The issue is that you subjected me to enhanced screening and public humiliation based solely on my ethnic appearance." The observation was accurate and devastating. Johnson's team had indeed singled out Khalil for additional attention before they knew anything about his background, military service, or travel purpose. Their decision had been based entirely on profiling that violated both TSA policies and basic principles of equal treatment. Dr. Chun, who had been documenting the entire interaction, stepped forward with her business card. "Colonel, I'm Dr. Sarah Chun, a civil rights attorney. What happened here today represents a clear case of discrimination, and I'd be honored to help you address this through appropriate legal channels." The offer of legal representation from a qualified civil rights attorney added another layer of complexity to the situation. Johnson realized that his actions were not only being observed by other passengers, but were also being documented by someone with the expertise to pursue formal complaints through federal channels. Agent Martinez, who had initiated the discriminatory screening, felt the full weight of her mistake as she began to understand Khalil's actual status. "Colonel, I had no idea about your service record. I was just following what I thought were appropriate security protocols." Khalil's response was measured but firm. "Agent Martinez, the problem is that your appropriate security protocols seem to involve different standards for passengers based on their ethnic appearance. The same screening process that you applied to me would never have been used on an elderly white passenger traveling with identical documentation. The comparison highlighted the discriminatory nature of the screening in terms that everyone present could understand. Other passengers nodded in agreement, recognizing that they had witnessed treatment that would never have been applied to someone who looked different. By this time, several passengers had uploaded videos of the incident to social media platforms, where they began to attract attention from news organizations and civil rights groups. The hashtag TSA discrimination started trending as people shared the videos and expressed outrage at the treatment of the military veteran. Airport Security Coordinator Lieutenant Williams, a former military officer himself, arrived at the checkpoint after being alerted to the situation by other airport personnel. His own military background allowed him to immediately recognize the significance of Khalil's credentials and the seriousness of the discrimination he had experienced. Colonel Al-Mansouri, on behalf of JFK Airport, "I want to formally apologize for the treatment you've received today," Williams said, his military bearing evident as he addressed a superior officer with appropriate respect. "This incident does not represent the standards we strive to maintain." But Khalil was not satisfied with apologies that failed to address systemic problems. Lieutenant Williams, individual apologies cannot fix institutional discrimination. Your TSA team profiled me based on ethnic appearance, and that same discrimination likely affects other passengers every day who don't have military credentials to protect them. The point was undeniable and highlighted the broader implications of the incident. While Khalil's military status had eventually protected him from the worst consequences of the profiling, countless other passengers faced similar discrimination without any recourse or protection. News reporter Jennifer Lopez from CNN, who happened to be traveling through JFK that day, recognized the newsworthiness of the situation and approached the group with her camera crew. "Colonel, would you be willing to speak on camera about what happened here today?" The presence of national media transformed the incident from an isolated airport matter into a potential national news story about discrimination in federal agencies. Johnson realized that his handling of the situation would likely be scrutinized by TSA headquarters and possibly congressional oversight committees. Khalil agreed to speak with the reporter, recognizing an opportunity to address the broader issues raised by his experience. "What happened to me today happens to Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and other minority passengers every day in airports across the country. The difference is that my military credentials eventually protected me, but other passengers don't have that protection." The interview was broadcast on CNN that evening and subsequently picked up by other major news networks, creating a national conversation about profiling in airport security. The story resonated particularly strongly with veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and members of Arab American communities who had experienced similar treatment. Within 48 hours, TSA headquarters launched a formal investigation into the incident, while several members of Congress called for hearings on discrimination in airport security. The American Civil Liberties Union announced that they would be monitoring the investigation and pursuing legal action if appropriate remedies were not implemented. Colonel Khalil Al-Mansouri used the attention generated by the incident to establish the Al-Mansouri Foundation for Equal Treatment, dedicated to combating discrimination against Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and other minority communities in federal agencies and public accommodations. The Foundation's first initiative was a comprehensive study of profiling practices in airport security, working with academic researchers and civil rights organizations to document patterns of discrimination and propose specific reforms to ensure equal treatment for all travelers. Agent Martinez and Supervisor Johnson both faced disciplinary action from TSA, including mandatory training on anti-discrimination policies and civil rights law. The incident became a case study used in TSA training programs to illustrate the importance of treating all passengers with equal respect and dignity. 6 months after the incident, Colonel Al-Mansouri was invited to speak at the annual conference of the International Association of Airport and Seaport Police, where his presentation on security without discrimination became one of the most watched training videos in aviation security history. The airport incident that began with casual prejudice ultimately became a catalyst for nationwide reforms in security procedures, ensuring that future travelers would be judged by legitimate security concerns rather than ethnic appearance or religious affiliation.